Morning. So I wanted to share some thoughts and meditations on a practice that uh, is that I found very practical for a long period of time, which is there's a and I'll base it around a quote. There and originally it's part of an old prayer, but the prayer goes, "The faults I see in others are the faults of myself. Therefore, I seek your blessings to uh, never see faults in others." And so I wanted to explain some of the different levels of meaning of this, the different like superficial levels and deeper levels of meaning of this. But um, the point is, we see faults in others quite naturally, and we see faults in ourselves not so easily. And when we do see faults in ourselves, it tends to be very disheartening and very heavy. And so when we do see faults in ourselves, it can weigh very heavily on us. Um, and so sometimes be a little bit difficult for us to process. So wanted to share a bit about that practice. But why don't we begin as usual, just with some meditation to settle in and settle our minds. So again, as usual, just finding a comfortable position and taking a deep breath in and out. Taking another breath after breath. And as we breathe, just inviting ourselves to relax, looking through our body for any signs of tension, like in our face or jaw, in our head or neck. We can check down through our shoulders, our arms and hands. And relax into our chest. Letting the breath move deeply through our abdomen, feeling our abdomen moving as we breathe. And some sense of relaxation down our torso into our buttocks. We relax down our legs, down through our calves and feet. And as we breathe, we allow the rhythm of our breath to grow deeper as we relax. and focus our attention on our breathing. And as distractions subside a bit, our breathing may become more relaxed. And as we try to meditate or keep our attention on our breathing, we may notice the struggle with distractions, worries, thoughts, fears, plans arising in our mind. And this kind of mental activity happens continually. But we can recognize all of this mental activity. This is what we can directly experience. We're not directly experiencing the minds of others. We don't know exactly or directly what their plans are, their thoughts, their wishes, intentions are. We only can see our own mind. But then we infer things, develop beliefs about others. So it's very important for us to get to know our own mind better and better, beginning to be more and more honest and clear about the activity in our own mind. Since this is the only thing we have relatively direct control over. Keeping our mind on our body, the feelings of our body, gives us something to ground our thoughts. Allows us to slow our thinking and to become more aware of each individual movement of our mind. And as we breathe in and out, we try to feel that breath, in particular in the area of our heart. Typically, deep inside our chest, there is not so much awareness of what's going on, just tension perhaps, or some darkness, but we try to imagine some light and space inside the center of our chest. And that with each breath in and out, that is illuminating inside of our body, and that we are removing our own tension, our own pain. For example, you can imagine breathing in white light and breathing out darkness with every breath. And then we can generate a sense of gratitude for everyone and everything that has been involved in us arriving at this moment. A sense of gratitude for our parents, friends, family, employers, employees, teachers, society. Every cell in our body, every thought in our mind depends on others directly or indirectly. And we can generate a wish to repay the kindness of others. Then with this motivation, we can gently relax our concentration and arise from our meditation. So there's a concept in psychology, not that I'm an expert in it, but called theory of mind. And the idea of theory of mind is that some more sophisticated creatures, like human beings, can develop a theory of what others are thinking. And so, for example, if you see my eyes go over here, you can think, he must be looking at something. And that implies that you can understand that I have a mind, that I have an intention, that I'm observing something. And not all creatures can do that, and babies maybe can't do that in the early stages of their development, is what I recall hearing. Again, not an expert on this, but the idea is that we hold in our mind some theory of others, that they have certain wishes, certain intentions, and so forth. Now, how do we know what others want? How do we know what others are like? Well, our best guide is our own experience, right? Our own perceptions, like, Andrew walked past a tray of pastries and he looked at the muffin. I bet he wants to eat that muffin, right? How do you know that? Because you know what it's like to want to eat a muffin. You're very familiar with that mind, perhaps. So you're like, I recognize that mind. So if I act in a very sort of bullying way, and like if I act in kind of like a critical way and like trying to put somebody down, then you will think, he's just trying to make them feel bad and make himself feel better, right? So you've got a theory at that point of why I'm doing that, like what I'm thinking, what's going on. But partly that's based on, your own experience. You kind of also know what it's like to want to feel good about yourself and want to put other people down. Not saying that that's a habit that any of us have, but it's probably something that we're familiar with, right? The it is instinctive for us to look for faults in others and to not see faults in ourselves. I mentioned previously this tendency, one of our psychological biases, unconscious bias, called attribution bias, which means basically that if something goes well, we tend to take credit for it. And if something goes poorly, we tend to find someone else to blame. And I think I mentioned this story about Monopoly players, right? Like these kids, getting an unfair advantage and then saying, "Well, it's because I'm very smart." But we naturally do this. We take credit for what goes well and blame others when something goes wrong. And so this is what is this? What does this tendency do for us? It tends we tend to use it to reinforce a sense that we are special in some way or better in some way, and to get the sense that others are non-special, or others are ordinary, or others are worse in different ways. Now, I'm not saying that we do this all the time for everybody, but there's this very strong tendency. And so the world ends up being a bit skewed like that. In contrast, we tend to find it very hard to acknowledge faults in our own mind. And when we do, we tend to oscillate very strongly between pride and being disheartened. So if we think that we have no faults, there's a tendency towards feeling pride, like I'm not, at least I'm not like that. And, at least I'm not a jealous person who's full of themselves and critical of others. And so we have some pride like that. But then if we do notice, actually, I wonder if I'm jealous. No. That couldn't possibly be. I couldn't possibly be jealous. Well, maybe it kind of looks a little bit like you're jealous. No, not me, right? Well, maybe. Oh no, I'm jealous. Oh no. And then it's like very hard, it's very heavy for us to like feel, oh God, I don't want to be a jealous person, but I am. And then there's this tension, right? Like we just feel very stuck. If we recognize a fault in ourselves, I tend to liken it to two magnets. If you have two positive magnets and try to push them close together, again, I've used this analogy before, but they don't want to connect, right? Like it takes some force to like hold the magnets together. And so the idea of us and faults, us and anything wrong with us, is very hard for us to acknowledge, partly because it's so painful and it feels like it would cast us into some minor depression if we were to see ourselves as ordinary like everybody else. So we're not like them, right? And so and there's all kinds of variations of this, right? There's like in group, out group things. Like I'm spend time with my parents, and they regularly verbally disparage, the 250 or 200 million Americans who are in the other political party, like broadly grouped together, 200 million idiots. It's like, well, that's a very broad generalization. Like that's a very large group of people to be clumping together. Um, or Americans are like, oh, I, 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 part of my lifetime responsibility is technical support for my parents. And so I bought antivirus for my parents. So the antivirus that I chose is with Kaspersky. Now, as we know, Kaspersky is a Russian company, and my dad and stepdad regularly express concern that why would they ever trust a Russian company? And how do we know they're not spying on them because they work for Putin? And so I've tried to talk them through the reasoning that the Russian government has absolutely no interest in you, Dad. Don't take it. You're not that important. But also we can't generalize, all Russians, all Chinese, all this, all that, right? But it's amazing how our mind does that, right? We create these massive groups, right? Oh, all Chinese, all Russians, all foreigners, all. But at the end of the day, every one of us is grouping together all others, right? We've got to look out for number one. At the end of the day, if we're under a lot of stress, you got to look out for number one. You got to look out for yourself, and everybody else is other. So there's a massive generalization of others as opposed to ourselves. Strong tendency to see ourselves as very special in one way or another. And to see faults in others. And one of the deepest faults that we see in others is that they are just ordinary. There's a tendency to see others as ordinary, and it's ordinary is an interesting word, right? Because it's the opposite of special, but it's also kind of the opposite of new. And our mind is always fascinated with what's new, right? We like things that are new and they have some sort of shine and attraction and so forth. And then things you've had for a while or you have been around for a while, they lose that shine and that attraction, unless you're a big fan of antiques and preservation and so forth, in which case maybe those things have a special allure. But our mind quickly categorizes things as ordinary. And when they're ordinary, they have less value. Typically, things that are common have less value, right? So because there's infinite of others, but there's only one of us, right? Clearly, we're more valuable. Right? Others are very ordinary. Right? You could find others anywhere, right? Like there's a gazillion of them. So we tend to see faults in others very quickly and ignore faults in ourselves. But one of the things that does, I mean, it does a lot of things, right? But it tends to reinforce some pride in our own mind and some obliviousness to our own faults. And so as a practice, just thinking the faults I see in others are the faults of myself. The faults I see in others are the faults of myself. And then having this as like a mantra that if you see someone who is impatient, you think, okay, where am I impatient? How am I impatient? Perhaps I'm impatient with impatient people. Like I see an impatient person, I'm like, can't stand I can't wait around for these people who are impatient. These people are judgmental. There's nobody that there's nobody worse than judgmental people, are there? It's like you sort of group everybody together in this big category of judgmental people, and you're like, oh, they're terrible. But of course, like it's just implying this strong tendency towards judging people ourselves, towards grouping people ourselves. So the opposite of that is acknowledging faults in ourselves. So the faults we see in others are the faults of ourselves. So using the perception of others' faults to become more aware of those tendencies in ourselves. So, for example, and really, you can use this in any situation, especially where you're beginning to feel a little bit uncomfortable. So if you're feeling it's a little bit dangerous example, but if you feel like I'm droning on and on and on and just saying the same things like all the time, you can think, I bet there's times in my life where I just drone on and on and on because I've got some captive audience. So it doesn't mean others don't need to improve as well, but the point is we have much less leverage over other people. In fact, we generally have almost no leverage over other people. We do have leverage over ourselves, right? Um, there was a statistic that I saw recently from some brain scientists that said we process about 11, and I put this in the chat here in our Slack chat, but we process about 11 million pieces of information per second. Our visual awareness processes about 10 million pieces of information per second. If you think about every retina cell that you've got, you know, lights and colors and shapes, and then all of your the other million is sounds and smells and tastes. There's a lot of data coming in through our senses, but our conscious processing power is only about 40 pieces of information per second. So if I ask you to, well, if you're listening to a conversation, for example, and you're processing things consciously and conceptually, you can only process about 40 pieces of information per second, as opposed to 11 million through our senses. So but the self that we think we are, the I who am listening to a teaching, the I who, just had breakfast or am going to have lunch, that I is the conscious I. That's the I that lives in the realm of 40 pieces of information per second. Is we tell a story about this conscious I, and we think, I'm going to do this, and I'm going to do that, all of this conscious planning. But that's not where the action is. All the action is happening with our instinctive reactions, our instinctive tendencies, these unconscious processing. Now, we have leverage over this unconscious processing, but only slowly. And that's one of the things that meditation can do, is can allow us to be, by becoming more peaceful, it allows you to become a bit more aware of what you're thinking, including the unsavory bits of your own mind, like your own jealousy and pride and competitiveness and cravings and impatience and whatever other list of faults that you might see in others. If you watch your mind long enough, they'll all come parading by. Every single one of those faults will make an appearance on the stage of your mind if you watch long enough. And so in meditation, you can become more aware of your mind and more peaceful and more calm, so that when you see a fault come through, you don't worry too much. You're just like, yes, there's my pride again, there's my jealousy again. You don't worry so much when they come through. And you can gradually begin to retrain your mind, retrain your instincts, so that when you see someone else having a fault, you don't have this instinctive arrogance just come up, but you can have a bit more empathy or humility. And that's retraining this, system one, this unconscious part of your mind. And so that's what we do in meditation. We retrain these unconscious parts of our mind. We become aware of these unconscious parts of our mind. We retrain these unconscious parts of our mind. So when we have interactions with others, using those to learn about ourselves. The faults we see in others are the faults of ourselves. So may we have the strength to transform our own, to use our perception of others' faults to get to know our own mind better, to change our own mind better. So the Western psychotherapy has mostly focused on a sort of a model of the mind where we are kind of passive victims of our parents and society, and so we get sort of impacted early in life, and as a result, then we have certain deep mental tendencies, and that's true, right? Like people who have very difficult upbringings, or traumatized at a young age, they have less capacity to deal with difficulties, maybe less empathy, and so forth. But the problem with that, with emphasizing that story, is that we have no power to undo what was done to us, right? Like, what can you do about that? Like, it's maybe useful if you become aware of it, then you can become a more cautious parent. And I've heard a number of people who say, my goal as a parent is to be a better parent than my parents were. That is my sole goal. And so that's great. That's like you've broken some intergenerational trauma, and you've got a guide to what not to do. And that's something we can learn when we see faults in others. We can think, okay, definitely need to be careful not to do that. But it is hard. You can't undo what was done, and you can't spend your life. You can't. You can't. You have no power to undo what was done. You have no power to go back in time and change other people or how they behave and so forth. So if we have, it's much more powerful for us to look at what power we do have right now, and to feel this sense of agency, this sense that we have the ability to intentionally purify, if you want, our own experience, where when we see faults in others, we think this reflects a fault in my own mind. And if it's in my mind, that's my home turf. I can change this. Even deep tendencies, deep instinctive tendencies, they're still your mind, right? Nobody else has that responsibility. No therapist can get that deep inside you. Drugs are certainly not a very precise remedy, right? They're very, like, they can make you feel a bit up, a bit down, or whatever, but they can't. That's not a very precise remedy. You're the one who has absolutely the most leverage, right, to get inside your own mind, to begin to work on changing some of these tendencies. And so we need to maximize our sense that this is our world, right? And on a deeper sense, like the meditation I guided recently, that the whole world is like a reflection of our own mind on a very deep level. But even like a very practical version of that is that when we see faults in others, use them to get to know our own mind, and then think, I'm going to change that. I'm going to work on my own pride. I see proud people. I'm like, I'm vulnerable to that. I need to work on that. You see jealous people, I think I'm vulnerable to that. I need to work on that. And so working on our own mind is not to deny that some of these tendencies are very deep, and not to deny that we may have learned some of these tendencies from our parents, or, carry them with us from our instincts or genetics or deep sources. It's just to say it's our responsibility. Okay, so why don't we take a few minutes just to let that settle in, and in particular we can contemplate this one thought: the faults I see in others are the faults of myself. Not taking that as something heavy, but using that to encourage ourselves to work on these deep tendencies. Just rolling this thought over in our mind and seeing what that brings to mind, what contemplations that spurs. The faults I see in others are the faults of myself. May I have the strength to recognize them, reduce these faults and overcome my own faults. Then we can make a decision or determination to carry this practice with us into our daily life. When we see faults in others, we can use that to be more aware of what's actually happening in our own mind. Not to be overwhelmed or disheartened, but just to be much more mindful, much more aware. And then we can just briefly imagine what would happen if we lived our life like that. What would happen if everyone lived their life like that? Instead of seeing faults in others, seeing faults in themselves so that they could work to overcome them. How much power would be generated from that? And then we can open our eyes and rise from our meditation.